As a reminder, rows 5 through 7 are the oral defense portion of the AP Research presentation and oral defense. Components of the presentation cannot be used to score oral defense components in rows 5 through 7, and components of the oral defense cannot be used to score presentation elements from rows 1 through 4. Before we dig into row 5, I want to remind you about the oral defense questions section as a whole. Remember, the student will be asked 3 to 4 oral defense questions. 3 of those questions are to come from required lists that students have access to online via pages 58 to 59 of the course and exam description. The panel will ask 1 question pertaining to the student's research or inquiry process, 1 question focused on their depth of understanding, and 1 question about the student's reflections throughout the inquiry process as evidenced in their process and reflection portfolio, something we lovingly call the PREP. The optional 4th question is at the discretion of the panel. It's not required, but may be used by the panel to get clarification on a particular detail provided in a response to a previous question, and can be used to score that particular row of the rubric. Student responses to each question should be brief and concise, no more than a few minutes. Further, the questions don't have to be asked in any given order, but for ease of grading it might be prudent to ask the questions in the order they will be scored on the rubric. Just a suggestion. So, the oral defense question, ODQ, for row 5 of the rubric pertains to the student's research process, which encompasses the choosing of their topic, the use and incorporation of sources for their lit review, their choice of method, the interpretation of evidence generated via their method, and the final development of their conclusion. In other words, their entire research process. Remember, you don't have to ask a question from this list verbatim. The question should be tailored to suit the student's actual research project, but the question asked should not be so changed as to leave it unrecognizable from this list or the intent of this list. In the rubric for each of these ODQs, the quality of the response comes from a logical explanation of student choices. The questions as written in the course and exam description don't add the bit about providing a logical explanation as to the appropriateness of the choice pertaining to the topic of inquiry, because that would be a redundant phrase to see over and over and over again at the end of these questions. You must teach students to think about their answers to these questions in the context of the requirements of the rubric. So, for example, if the student was asked the first question on this list about what information guided their choice of research method or artistic process, the student must first identify that information, and then, in order to address the proficient column of the rubric, must provide a logical explanation of why the information made the choice appropriate to the topic of inquiry. Let's look at the verbs, qualifiers, and conjunctions as we examine row 5 of the rubric. As a reminder, this is a 2-column row of the rubric, so instead of thinking of the cells as low, medium, or high, let's think of them as not proficient versus proficient. For example, in the not proficient column, the student must have simply identified the inquiry choice being questioned about, but provide an explanation for the choice that is superficial or illogical, such as, I chose this because it was the right thing to do, or I chose this, and then gives an obviously illogical rationale for why the choice was made, such as choosing to survey people about attitudes when you're actually looking for their behaviors pertaining to a particular topic. In order for the response to cross over into the proficient column, the student must identify the choice being made and provide an effective explanation that demonstrates why the choice made was logical and appropriate to the research process. So, for not proficient, the student identifies the choice in question pertaining to their research process and gives an ineffective or shallow explanation as to the appropriateness of that choice, or may not give an explanation at all. For the proficient column, the student identifies and explains logically why that choice was appropriate to their process. Let's look at some examples. So, row 5 is about establishing one's argument as it pertains to the oral defense question of the choices made during the research process. We're simply looking for evidence that the student identified the choice in question and logically explained the appropriateness for that choice pertaining to their topic of inquiry. In the alcohol abuse and commercials video, the student was asked around time 12:54 what information guided the choice of method. The student simply reiterates what she had already stated in the methods section of her presentation, namely that she used examples from previous studies to determine that a correlational and content analysis combined would give the most clear results. The student achieved the proficient column of this row because she identified studies she used in her lit review that influenced her method choice, and then she logically explains why those choices were appropriate. Compare that to the Comfort Women video where, at time 1434, the student is asked about the information that guided her choice of research method. Her response is that a BBC News article sparked her interest in the subject. The student identified the choice but did not provide us with a logical explanation of how using this article led her to choose her research method and why that choice was appropriate. Since the student only identified the choice and did not provide a logical explanation as to the appropriateness of that choice to identifying a line method, this response cannot move into the proficient column. So, row 5 focuses on students responding to an oral defense question about the choices they made during the research process and defending those choices with a logical explanation as to the appropriateness of those choices. First, I've yet to see a 0 score for this row of the rubric. The only way a student could get a 0 is by not answering the question at all. That's kind of the way the rubric is written. Not proficient responses will usually be an identification of the choice made, but with a superficial or illogical explanation as to its appropriateness to the research process in question, or maybe they don't even state or give an explanation at all. Proficient responses demonstrate that the student not only identified the choice in question, but provided an explanation of the logical rationale for the appropriateness of that choice to the inquiry process. I feel a little like an airline stewardess here telling you how to buckle your seatbelt when you clearly already know how to do that. With that said, your exits are here, here, and please proceed to the next presentation about row 6 of the presentation and oral defense rubric.